Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you to Mary for the kind introduction. I want to say a special thank you to Adriana and to the survivors for sharing their stories. So important. I was involved many years ago with putting together the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center for the precise reason that it's so important to share the stories of survivors. And as I watch the video tonight and as I meet Adriana and other survivors, I'm saddened, in a way, that here we are, that torture, oppression, all around the world continues. But I'm also heartened by the amazing work of this organization and the terrific generosity of Peter Kovler and the Kovler family and so many volunteers and staff people who put so much effort and time into standing up for the survivors. So I want to say a deep and heartfelt thank you to all of you. It's really an honor to be here tonight to celebrate the Kovler Center and the important work that Heartland Alliance does across the nation and the world. And I'm just so proud to be the governor of a state that calls this organization home. We're all here tonight because we believe in the advancement of human rights, because we believe that we are stronger and more prosperous as a society when all of us have a chance to belong. But when it comes to our politics, it takes courage and integrity to pursue an agenda guided not by what is necessarily most popular, or at a given moment, what is palatable, but instead to be guided by what is right. Time and again, Hillary Clinton has shown us her willingness to stand up for a vision of a fairer world, and often to take down the old guard that embraced the status quo. When I think of her, I see the very definition of courage. Fighting and sacrificing for the greater good. We saw her courage at work when she was a young woman, fighting against discrimination in the South, and as a children's rights advocate. Her courage was demonstrated again when she broke the mold as First Lady and sent a message to the world that the role of women in policymaking and in the workplace has changed forevermore. We saw her courage in that seminal speech in Beijing, when she declared, in a world seemingly full of a bunch of misogynist leaders, that women's rights are human rights. And we saw her courage years later when, as our Secretary of State, she modernized our nation's foreign policy to embrace women's empowerment as a security interest for the United States of America. Because she knows that the safety of women and girls across the world is a moral quest. And that's in her soul, to make that moral quest. It's an issue of national defense, of global peace and financial stability. That's what she told us, and she was right. She has built a career committed to this fundamental truth, that if our vision of the future ignores our most marginalized people, there is no hope for true prosperity in the United States or the world. We're in a moment in America where our leadership doesn't reflect our country as we believe it ought to be. But as tonight's keynote speaker has shown us time and time again, we can't sit around and wait for someone else to write history. We have to do the work ourselves. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming home to Illinois one of our nation's most forward-thinking and courageous public servants, and my dear friend, Hillary Clinton.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Wow, this has already been such an extraordinary evening, and it is wonderful to be back home in Chicago with all of you, and I want to thank the governor. I think he has demonstrated in his short tenure already his commitment to this state and to its people. And being here tonight says a lot about what kind of governor and man J.B. Pritzker is. I want to thank the staff and volunteers at Heartland Alliance International and the Marjorie Kovler Center for your work. To the survivors who are here tonight, some of whom have shared their stories with us through the films we have seen, thank you for your courage, for your support of this organization, and your witness, which may be the most important gift you can give, so that none of us ever forget the obligation that we have as fellow human beings to do all that we can to reduce the threat and the reality of torture anywhere in the world. Now, I would have been delighted to attend the Power of Healing benefit under any circumstances, but I am especially grateful to be here because of the person you are honoring tonight. Rarely does Peter Kovler agree to be honored. In fact, I am told he had to be talked into this. And I know that from firsthand observation. He is so dedicated to the two important tasks that are his life's work: ending torture and healing survivors, along with promoting the legacy of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. And he is joined in this mission by his family, and with us tonight are his wonderful partner, his wife, Judy Kovler, and his son, a public defender in Washington, Daniel Kovler. And their presence here speaks volumes also about their support for this work and for Peter's passion. Now, if you know Peter, you know that he reads about 10 newspapers before dawn, which is about the time some of you probably get an email from him if there is an article that he thinks you should read. especially if that article has anything to do with Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, but even more so if it's an article exposing torture. Now, if we were to go back in time to 1986, we could envision that moment of an even more active and vivacious Peter Kovler. That is possible, I suppose, in some alternative universe. But as he said, and as the introduction of him noted, he was reading a copy of the Washington Post, a print copy. And for the younger people in the audience, that is how the news used to come, on paper. And buried in the back of the A section, he spotted a tiny 2-paragraph article about people in Copenhagen who had founded a center for asylum seekers who had endured torture and struggled to manage its horrific aftershocks. Peter immediately decided that we had to do that in our own country. What could be more American than welcoming the tempest-tossed to our shores? So, true to form, he got to work using his favorite instrument, the telephone. 35 cold calls later, the only group that evidenced any interest was the Heartland Alliance. And Peter stood with you every step of the way in creating this center, not just with his checkbook, but with his heart and his voice. He lobbied Congress, presidential administrations, mayors, and governors to speak out against torture and to welcome survivors into our communities. He worked with universities to urge scholars and students to study the after effects of torture so that survivors could have help and understanding in staring down their nightmares, healing from their wounds, and finding the courage to build a new life. Peter and the team named the center in honor of his mother, Marjorie, who fled persecution from the Nazis, passed through Ellis Island, and started a family in Chicago. Peter often says that his mother taught him to care about the underdog, to advocate for those who need someone in their corner. And that's really what the Marjorie Kovler Center does, day in and day out. Since 1987, the center has stood as a bulwark against hate. Its doors are open to people who have suffered unimaginable losses, whose pain we can scarcely comprehend. As Mario Gonzalez says, this is not charity, this is solidarity. I think all of us should borrow that line and remind ourselves and remind our fellow citizens what it means to be a member of the human race and how important it is to extend a helping hand to those in need. Now, the center reaches almost 400 survivors from 60 countries each year, providing medical and rehabilitative care, from primary and dental care to occupational therapy. It provides mental health services, which are so essential, social services like help signing up for health insurance and legal support, housing, and employment resources. Perhaps most importantly, it has become a beacon of hope for the 7 million victims of torture worldwide. The Kovler Center, much like Peter himself, shows no signs of losing steam. In 2020, the center has plans to expand their mental health resources, make even more investments in their committed team, and continue to reach out to marginalized people and communities. We have heard that torture is intense, physical, and psychological pain inflicted by those who want to control your entire being, mind and body. It can take many forms, from waterboarding to gang rape, to burning and branding, to sleep deprivation and starvation. And watching your family suffer is torture as well. But if the goal of torture is to disempower people and communities, the goal of the Kovler Center is the exact opposite: to empower survivors to become agents of change, to help restore hope, rebuild trust, reestablish a sense of community and belonging. So your work has always been important, but I think we all know it has taken on a new urgency over these last few years. More than 7 decades ago, 48 nations, representing the vast majority of the world's people at that time, voted in favor of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which affirmed for the first time the radical idea that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity. That human rights are not granted by governments, they are the birthright of every woman, man, and child. Since then, the Declaration has become the single most widely translated single document in the history of the world. Generations of activists, leaders, ordinary citizens have tried to carry its principles forward. They have fought and organized, campaigned to tear down barriers that prevented people from enjoying the full measure of freedom, the full experience of dignity, the full benefits of citizenship. They've built a system of international law and institutions to protect the freedoms spelled out in the Declaration and to hold violators accountable. They've woven human rights into domestic constitutions and made them a crucial test of any government's legitimacy. And yet, despite all that work, today those human rights hang in the balance, at home and around the world. Even Eleanor Roosevelt, who risked so much and worked so hard to champion the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, knew that it was only a first step. From her deathbed, she continued to call out a message to future generations. Staying aloof, she said, is not a solution. It is a cowardly evasion. And right now, my friends, the last thing we can afford to be is aloof. I was horrified, but not surprised, when I read Ann Barnard's expose in the New York Times just this past weekend that described in painful detail the secret network of torture sites and execution centers in Syria. The stories she recounts are harrowing: brutal sexual violence, dehumanization, psychological terror. Torture is a global problem. It's also a local problem. Research from the Center for Victims of Torture suggests that as many as 44% of refugees in the United States are torture survivors. These are people who came here to heal, to find safety, to pursue their dreams for themselves and their families. Just look at the humanitarian crises that have been unfolding at our southern border for more than a year. Families fleeing the drug cartels who treat human suffering as a team sport. Young children desperate to grow up away from police, acting as enforcers of the gangs rather than as guardians protecting the public. Adults whose lives have been fractured by fear, deprivation, sexual assault, and political repression. Some have literally walked thousands of miles, slept in the open under thunderstorms and blazing sunshine, because America is a safe harbor, a land they want to reach, to survive, to call home. Yet we all know that too many are finding a different America awaits them, one that separates tens of thousands of immigrant children from their families, places them in barbed wire detention cages as though they were in jail. One that assumes their parents and adults who accompanied them are criminals, addicts, freeloaders, rather than fellow human beings who deserve dignity and respect. This is an abdication of America's moral responsibility to its own core values. And that is the national emergency we need to solve. If our government were really serious about solving it, instead of using the issue as a political drum to beat at the expense of people's lives, children's lives, they would stop the cruel abuses at the border. They would do everything in their power to ensure a fair process that protects people's fundamental rights. They could, for example, increase the number of immigration judges so that they could process people more quickly to reach resolution. And they would certainly have created a system to track the whereabouts of families so children don't get separated and maybe never return. That, by the way, is the bare minimum we should demand. And this administration should remove the onerous restrictions they have imposed upon those seeking asylum, as if those who did not have money for food or shelter or transportation here would have funds to cover application fees and retain their lawyers. And rather than arbitrarily restrict the number of applications and make it much harder to file those applications, they should be building a system that can handle the asylum seekers, and they should also reverse the decision to end aid to Central America but instead should be doing what we did in Colombia, what we have done in other places, to build institutions so that people do not have to flee in the first place because they have law and order and security at home. And of course, right now, we could be figuring out how to pass comprehensive immigration reform with a path to citizenship, which is not a pipe dream. That was a bill that I actually voted for when I was in the Senate, that passed the Senate, that George W. Bush said he would sign, which was never brought up in the House. And then it was done again in 2013. But some would rather have a political issue than a solution. And think of the DACA residents, young people who have grown up here, who are totally American. They respect diversity and rights. They go to school, they go to work. I have met hundreds of these young people. They should not have to live in fear of being forcibly returned to a nation they have never known or lived in. They are contributing to the United States right now. And, you know, here perhaps is the greatest insult to our intelligence and our sense of security. Because we can observe people's rights and protect national security at the same time. We actually have been doing that for quite a number of years. We know that we welcome people not just because we are good-hearted and we have certain values that we wish to follow, because it's good for us. One of the reasons that we are doing so well is because our diversity is one of our strengths. And for us to turn our backs on people of all ages, but particularly young people who want to make their future here, who are laying their stake in what they envision as the opportunities that their hard work will create for them, is absolutely backwards. You know, the cruelty of this administration's actions are laid bare when we remind ourselves that America is really good at doing things if we decide we want to do them. But that takes more than demagoguery. It takes leadership and political courage. I was in the Senate when less than a decade ago, well, now it's actually more than a decade. Time flies when so much is happening. But I remember very well, because I happened to be on the Armed Services Committee, when we confronted waterboarding, when we confronted Abu Ghraib, when we saw the damage, the torture inflicted on our standing in the world, not to mention on our own conscience and on the consciences of our men and women in the military. I remember those hearings as those who had served, led most notably by John McCain, hammered the administration and those in the chain of command for ever permitting what those pictures showed us had been done in the name of the United States of America. I remember John McCain going to the floor of the Senate, a man who himself was a survivor of torture, to condemn it, to demand that it be stopped. And President Obama outlawed it when he became the president of our country. I spent 4 years as Secretary of State traveling the world to help prove that we had turned a corner and left that way, way behind us. But now, instead of continuing to move forward, instead of standing up for human rights, our government wants to turn a blind eye and build a wall. We cannot let this fundamentally un-American distrust and fear determine our future. Since when did we become a fearful, angry, resentful, insecure people? We are a nation of dreamers and strivers, spurred on by our commitment to democracy and its ever-expanding purpose. That is who we are, and we must demonstrate that again. Address these challenges. Address them with courage and compassion, and say in a clear, firm voice that torture, physical and psychological, is wrong and will not be tolerated, whether it happens in a prison in Syria or in a cage on our southern border. So, let us all commit to do what happens every day at the Marjorie Kovler Center. Build a society that is secure and welcoming, where everyone counts and everyone contributes, where people who are newcomers are invited in, where they're offered hospitality, and where we have a chance to build a stronger and broader community. It can be done here and around the world. I have seen it. The United States has helped it happen. And now, once again, we are called upon to stand with moral clarity. And when the voices around us make all the usual political arguments, when they raise all of the questions, we say, of course, we are not for open borders. That is not what this is about. But we are for open minds and open hearts. And that is what we will stand for. So, there's a lot that should be done. I remember going to the Democratic Republic of Congo, where soldiers in militias and in the government pillaged and raped their way across that beautiful country as a way of dominating communities and gaining tactical advantage, including by the brutal, relentless mass rapes that were conducted. I remember going to the eastern city of Goma, filled with displaced people. It had become known as the rape capital of the world. Around 36 women a day, 1,100 a month reported rapes. We'll never know how many went unreported. I met with NGO workers, doctors, counselors, UN officials, but most importantly, survivors. They were all working to help repair the broken bodies and the spirits of women. The courage and the grace that these women and their families showed in refugee camps, in hospitals, in community centers, where they had come together to support each other, is the first thing I thought about when I was invited to be here tonight. I thought about their faces, their determination, and how they were helping each other. They had seen the worst of humanity and the best. We need to be reminded of both. And that is what you do here. And it's extraordinary to see this ballroom filled. But the work that is done here must leave with you. Leave as you walk out of the ballroom. Find ways not only to support the center, but to stand up and speak out about what this center really epitomizes. The best of our country, the best of our humanity. God bless the Marjorie Kovler Center, the Heartland Alliance, all who support it, and all the survivors who are the testaments to the importance of this work. Thank you all very much.